Hello, welcome to History 1378. I'm Professor Bazanko. This is an online asynchronous class, which means that I'll be recording the videos and then putting them up on the internet, and you can watch them based on your own schedule. You don't have to watch them at the same time every week, and you don't have to watch them on Tuesday and Thursday at 2:30 or 4 or whatever. So it'll fit your schedule. I haven't done a Zoom class before, although I've done online teaching and distance ed, so it's sort of similar. It's unusual not to have students in front of me, so we'll get that figured out. But I can assure you, you'll get a good semester of history just as if you were sitting in a lecture hall right in front of me. So, we'll give it our best. You can always get in touch with me and the TAs, and I'll give you all the information you need from the syllabus and outlines, and you should already be up on Blackboard, so that shouldn't be a problem. So let's get going. Obviously, if you have any questions at any point, you can email the TAs, you can email me. Our email addresses will be provided, and you can also always contact us through Blackboard. So now what I'm going to do is put up the syllabus. And if you were in class, I'd have a big projector overhead in the lecture hall, and this would be on it, and I would go over it. So it's going to be kind of like that. I'm going to try to make this as realistic as possible under the circumstances. Anyway, you can find this syllabus online. It's on my website at this address, but it'll also be up on the Blackboard. I'll have the TAs put it on Blackboard. So this is History 1378 syllabus. You can ignore that date. I updated, and that's the date I originally posted it. History 1378, me, online asynchronous, as I just said. I'll record lectures, I'll post them. I'll always let you know when a new lecture is posted. And you can watch them, and we'll give you all the information you need about assignments, about testing, about anything else on Blackboard. So you should be already enrolled in Blackboard. Check it out if there's a problem. And I mean, you could let us know, but I think that's more of a UH registrations issue. But everything should be fine. So one of the most important things to know, especially always, but especially in this class, is who the teaching assistants are. And I'm teaching two sections of 1378, one at 2:30, one at 4, although in reality, they're whenever you want to watch them, right? So, but if you are enrolled in the 2:30 class, your primary TAs will be John A. Willis and Catherine McGranahan. And if you're enrolled in the 4 o'clock class, your primary TAs will be Patrick Higgins and Valerie Butler Harris. If you're ever in a bind and you need to get a hold of somebody quickly and you can't get a hold of your TA for your class, you can always contact someone from the other class as well, but I don't think that'll be an issue. All right, so those are the TAs. They're important to know for lots of reasons. For one thing, they're going to do the testing. They'll handle the tests, which we'll do online. They'll grade them. They'll be available, whenever possible. Normally they'd have office hours, but that's not the issue here. So I don't know if they'll want to set up specific times to be emailed, or whether you can just email them or contact them on Blackboard, and they'll get back to you whenever possible. Either way, we're all going to be pretty accessible, so I wouldn't worry about that. So that's the information to get a hold of them. The books, I've already gotten a couple emails asking about the books. What's required is a book package, which is called America from 1865 to COVID-19. It's published by Nunn McGinty. That package has 3 books in it. So you're buying one particular thing, this package, America from 1865 to COVID-19, but that's going to have 3 different books in it. So you buy one, you get 3. You can get it at the bookstore. You'll get a code, an access code, I believe. It's an electronic book, or you can buy it online directly from the publisher there. The 3 books in that package are Reconstruction to Rebellion, from Reconstruction to Rebellion, which is kind of a textbook, and then there are 2 readers. One is called Texts and Speeches in U.S. History, which are documents and speeches that famous Americans have made. And then the other one is called Interpretations of U.S. History. When we get down lower, and I have the reading assignments there, the textbook reading Reconstruction and Rebellion is going to be listed as RR, and the other ones will be listed as text and interpretation. So just keep that in mind. Most stuff can always be found on the syllabus. So if you have any questions about, assignments or what to read or anything like that, check the syllabus out first, because almost always you can find what you need on there. Grading, even though it's an online course, the grading will be pretty much the same as I would do it if this was a class, in a classroom. We'll have 3 exams. There'll be one test, midterm, whatever you want to call it, somewhere around week 5 or 6, and then another one around week 10, and there'll be a final exam based on the UH exam schedule. We'll do all these tests online. At this point, I assume I'm just going to tell you that you can use your books during the exams, because it's kind of hard to prohibit that anyway. And my goal here is actually to get you to learn history. So, it's really important to do the readings. I'm going to say that all the time. You have to do the readings. That's the most important element of this. Watch these lectures, do the readings. The textbook and the lectures follow exactly. So, if there's something in the book that you may not have understood, check out the lecture. If there's something in the lecture that I've said that isn't quite clear, or you want more detail on it, go to the book, all right? So it's really important to do all the reading and keep up with that as much as possible. So the grading will be based on 3 tests, kind of a midterm in week 5 or 6, another one in like week 10 in the final. There'll be mostly some form of writing. So there'll be essays, maybe short answers. Before the exams, we'll give you practice sheets, practice questions. Normally, if this was an in-person class, the TAs would have review sessions where you could come in and talk to them about the practice questions. That's not an issue here, but they'll be available. We'll all be available if you have any questions. Sometimes students study among themselves, which is fine. So there's plenty of ways to prepare for this. And we'll give you all the information ahead of time. It won't be, like a sneak attack where, like we say, there's a test tomorrow or anything like that. So don't worry about that. There are also going to be some extra credit available. As it stands now, what I'll probably do, and I think I have them already in the syllabus, is I have some podcasts that are a history podcast that a friend and I do together. And so in some cases, we've talked about themes that we'll talk about in class as well. So you can listen to the podcast and we'll let you answer a question or write something about it for a few extra points. And over the course of the semester, those can add up and actually help your grade, a fair amount. So that'll be available too. And again, just stay in touch on Blackboard as much as possible, and you'll get what you need to know there. Makeup policy probably isn't as big a deal this year, again, because we're online. So, you're not gonna have to worry about flat tires and, stuff like that. We'll set it up so that the exams will be conducted at a specific time. So you'll have to be online for a specific period of time and do them then. If something comes up, obviously let the TAs know as soon as possible, and we'll figure something out, all right? But, it needs to be a legitimate excuse, okay? So, but again, like I said, since this is online, I don't think we'll have issues like I would normally in that particular, thing of the makeup exams. Attend class regularly, keep up with the readings well, If you have any questions about incomplete or things like that, go to the UH handbook for students. Also on Blackboard, if there's any document from UH about this semester, about the requirements for the semester, we'll put it on there. So, like I said, check Blackboard. Also, I mentioned the textbook earlier. If there are any questions about downloading or accessing the books, you can contact documents@nunnmcginty.com, and we'll put a document up there on Blackboard from Nunn McGinty, which tells you how to go about doing it, or how to handle any issues you have, kind of an FAQ kind of thing. So check that out. I really don't know much about the technical aspects of that. So if you have any issues with the books, contact Nunn McGinty. Generally, we have this program, this policy regarding questioning your grades, just because usually we hand them out in class and everybody is upset or happy or whatever, and they immediately go to the TAs. That's not an issue this semester. So if you have any questions about the grading of your test after you get them back, just politely send an email or message to the TA and set up either an online conversation or express your questions in an email, or just handle it the right way. Go to the TA first because, you know, the TA is great at it. If you have any questions after that, obviously come to me. Come to me anytime, you know, you want. But, you know, in terms of grading, go to the TA first. All right. So this is the nuts and bolts of it. These are the topics and the reading assignments for this semester. And as I said before, the books are listed as our Reconstruction, Rebellion, the text and the interpretations. And so this is just kind of a general idea of what we'll try to do. And sometimes I'll be ahead, sometimes I might not be. What I'll try to do on these lectures is do them for about, you know, an hour 15, which is the length they would be in class. I might go short, I might go a little longer. Again, since you're watching these on your time, you can pause them, you can go back and look at them later. The timing isn't as big a problem as if you were in a classroom and you had to get out of there and go to another building for another class. So that really shouldn't be an issue in this particular case. So the lectures on video will be somewhere, you know, they'll be north of an hour, but you know, they won't be too long, and we'll cover everything in class. I can't give you an exact number for the amount of lectures I'll do because of that. You know, it's not the same as if I were in class, but they'll be anywhere from 25 to 28, I'm assuming, maybe more, you know, maybe less, I don't know, but somewhere in that ballpark range. But we'll let you know ahead of time. They'll always be up. I plan on recording these prior to the week that, you know, class is scheduled, so you should always be able to stay ahead, and we'll let you know where you need to be in terms of testing and everything else. So week one, which will be, you know, as you're watching this, the coming week, this is kind of the theme that we'll be trying to talk about. In this particular case, you know, Reconstruction, the period of Reconstruction, the origins of capitalism, and then if we get to it, this kind of growing conflict between labor and bosses and imperialism, empire. Because I'm recording these, I probably won't be as spontaneous as I would be in a regular classroom. Often, you know, I'll have questions, people ask questions, or there'll be something coming up, and we can talk about that. I probably won't be doing that as much, but I may, from time to time, make references to issues that are happening today with regard to history. You know, for instance, in class one, something like Confederate statues, which are really in the news right now, right? So we might talk about stuff like that. It might come up. And obviously, if you have any questions about things like that, you can, again, send them to the TAs, send them to me, and I can take it up either with you one-to-one, or I can bring it up in a subsequent lecture that I'm recording. So week one, we'll talk about that period after the Civil War. You'll read chapter 1 in the Reconstruction Rebellion, and then you'll read chapter 1 in the texts. And then from there, you can just follow it that way. So these will be the topics, and these will be the reading assignments. Now in week 2, for instance, I mentioned extra credit. So there's a podcast. There was a huge general strike in Seattle in 1919. We have an interview with a historian who's written a lot of stuff about it. He's written books about it. And so you can listen to that, and then we'll tell you what to do, and you can you know, turn it in on Blackboard, and you could get some extra credit for that. Same thing here. Week 3, this is kind of about the World War I period. These are the reading assignments. And again, there's a podcast on a famous incident that happened here in Houston, the Camp Logan uprising. Very few people know about it, unfortunately. So you can listen to that for some extra credit. And then it goes on week 4, week 5, the New Deal. There's another podcast. World War II, the Cold War, and so forth, right? And so it's pretty easy to follow. And again, you know, just keep on top of things, watch the videos, and do the reading. I can't stress that enough, and you'll be fine. Okay. So I think that's kind of what you need to know about the syllabus. If you have any questions, let us know, and you know, I can give you more information. But I think it's spelled out fairly clearly there. And you know, just like I said, keep checking Blackboard. Okay. So that's the way the class is going to be structured. That's the way it's going to be organized. And, you know, we'll give you information throughout the semester as you need it. If anything comes up, or if you have any issues, you can always contact us. So what I'll do now is actually start talking a little bit about the period after Reconstruction. And if you were in a lecture hall, if you were in Agnes Arnold Auditorium or wherever, you would come in, and you would see this on the screen, you know, behind me in the big auditorium. And these are always up. every class when you come in. This will be up. Now, these are outlines for the lectures. This is important because this is basically, the guidebook, the handbook to what we're going to cover in class on that particular day. So when you come in, this will be, kind of up there. And when it comes time to prepare for exams, when it comes time to figure out, whatever, regarding the class, this is important. This is, I'll follow these, not, maybe not exactly. I may diverge a little bit, maybe spend more time on something, skip something, who knows, but for the most part, just follow these very closely. These are going to be the outlines, and they're, consistent with the book from Reconstruction and Rebellion too. So you can find, stuff in both places. All right. So what we do when we get started here is talk about the period right after the Civil War. And I don't know how many of you have had history classes at UH where you might have had history 1377, which covers the period from colonization to the Civil War. How many of you may have had it in high school? So I'm just going to assume you know some things about it and then go from there. The Civil War left the South absolutely devastated. It was wiped out. And, the war itself had been destructive. It had, the Northern Army had gone through the South and destroyed the infrastructure, which are like the roads, the bridges, the communications networks, and obviously the plantations, the farms. The South was wiped out. It had lost billions of dollars in property. And we'll get to this in a second, of course, in more detail. Slavery had been, outlawed and then abolished by constitutional amendment. So the South is very different. And so what happens in the aftermath of that is called Reconstruction, because you have to reconstruct the United States. And Reconstruction takes place on many different levels. You have an economic reconstruction, you have a political reconstruction, and then most importantly in this regard, I think, and what we're seeing in 2020, in the last several months especially, is you have this reconstruction regarding the type of society the United States is going to become, and especially with regard to the issue of race, to the issue of ex-slaves. And so that's really going to be important. So these are, like I said, there's kind of like three key issues, although I have four things on here. So we'll talk about that too. So you have Reconstruction to begin. And as I said, if you have any questions as I'm talking about this, take notes, I think would be a good idea. But if you have any questions about this, jot them down, put them up on send them to us on Blackboard or however, and we'll help you out. So there are three key issues in the period after the Civil War. Reconstruction and the South, we can link those together as one and two. The expansion of the United States all the way to the West Coast, to the Pacific Ocean is another. And then economically, what the Civil War does is it shows the triumph of industrial capitalism, right? So the first question that had to be dealt with was how to bring the South back into the Union. Remember, Southern states had seceded, formed the Confederacy, which is why today the issue of things like the Confederate flag are so, symbolically important. The South seceded from the United States. It left the Union, and it did so in order to keep slaves. For the South, the Civil War was a war to maintain slavery. And that's important to understand. So there was a great deal of animosity, and there were a lot of different ideas about how to deal with those Southern states re-entering the United States, since they had formed their own, country, their own government, the Confederate States of America. They were defeated. They lost the war in 1865. So the question then became how to let them back in. There were some people who wanted a harsh punishment, who wanted Southern leaders declared traitors or even jailed, who wanted Southern states not to be allowed in until the majority of people in those states declared their allegiance to the United States, to the government, the federal government. However, the way things worked out, the Southern states came back into the Union fairly easily. Abraham Lincoln, remember, was assassinated, as the war ended. But his plan wasn't even really that radical. He had actually vetoed a law that would have made it harder for the South to come back into the United States, the Wade-Davis plan, Wade-Davis law. But his successor, Andrew Johnson, allowed those southern states to come back in with a minimal amount of difficulty. I think 10% of the people in those states had to claim their loyalty to the United States. And then, as we'll see in a minute, he even actually pardoned the leaders of those states, which had led the secession movement. So the South comes back in fairly easily, which means that the people in charge of those southern states are going to be pretty much the same people who were in charge of those southern states prior to the Civil War. So there's not really a fundamental change in Southern politics, and as we'll see, in Southern racial politics as well. Okay? So if the South comes back in easily, then what does that mean for the ex-slaves in these Southern states? Well, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments address slavery. It abolished slavery. It gave African Americans citizenship rights, the 14th Amendment, which has been in the news a lot the last few years. And then it gave Black men the right to vote. So slavery at a national level, at a constitutional level, was addressed, but the plight of ex-slaves really wasn't, other than to say that slavery was abolished and they're allowed to vote, and they were citizens according to the 14th Amendment. As I said, the 14th Amendment has kind of been in the news a lot lately. This is an article from not that long ago where the president said that he wanted to reconsider the 14th Amendment and not allow people to become citizens based on birth in the United States. Slaves, remember, were not citizens, they were considered property. So the 14th Amendment gave them citizenship based on their birthright. And many people have this, people who come to the United States and have children, those kids are citizens by virtue of being born in the United States, even if their parents were not citizens yet. It happened to me. My parents were both born to, my 4 grandparents were not yet citizens. They were Italian immigrants. So it's really common. It happens all the time. So that was one of the issues that was addressed. However, in real terms, for ex-slaves in the South, the situation was not all that great. Things hadn't changed as much as in their daily lives, in their lives, as they lived day to day, had not changed as much. One slave said, "We were set free without any land, without any money. We were given nothing but freedom." And this is the key point. What happens in Reconstruction is there's a political movement based on these 3 amendments to address the problem of what happened with slaves, right? So the slavery is abolished and they're citizens and they're Black men have a right to vote. However, it doesn't address the economic conditions, the material conditions that existed during slavery, and how things haven't really changed all that much for them. So what happens in the aftermath of the Civil War, all right? Now, in class, I would put this picture up and I would say, what does that look like? And quite often people would say, oh, that's a group of slaves in a cotton field picking cotton, right? And then I would point out that this is from 1907 and these are in fact not slaves, right? These are sharecroppers, and this is one of the huge issues that occurred after the Civil War. Instead of creating some kind of economy that would enable African Americans, that would enable these ex-slaves to benefit from what had happened, during slavery, from their manumission, the Southern planters who had run Southern society prior to the Civil War back in charge, and they want to recreate the social system, the racial system that they had. And so rather than provide Blacks with the ability to create some kind of independent life, they tried to reinstitute Southern society based on the plantation model. And how did they do that? Well, so one of the first things that the federal government did was to try to create a government program to assist ex-slaves. There were a group of Republicans called Radical Republicans, and radical in the sense that they actually believed that these ex-slaves needed to be brought into American society, given actual rights, and given access to what what is really necessary to have an independent life, which is, things like, especially in that particular case, the most important of these politicians were senators from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. And for a brief time, especially after Lincoln's assassination, these radical Republicans because after Lincoln was killed, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, wasn't a very well-known or strong leader, Southerners from Tennessee. So these radical Republicans in this brief period after Lincoln had been assassinated were able to kind of get a bunch of stuff done. And maybe the most important thing they did was establish in March of 1865, this is, right before the war ended, they created a program called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is quite important. Let me put this back up there. It's here, like a lot of times on these outlines. In addition to the outlines, I'll have certain terms like, sharecropping is down here too. So the Freedmen's Bureau is really important. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was only created to last a year, so it had to do a lot in a short period of time. The idea behind the Freedmen's Bureau was that the key to being independent, now nothing is more dependent than being a slave, right? Your property. So the key to being independent was to have your own land, to have your own property, right? Land was the most important element in the Freedmen's Bureau, the most important element in this radical idea about what Reconstruction would do. Now, the problem with this is the Freedmen's Bureau, let me go back. The Freedmen's Bureau essentially promises ex-slaves, and I'm sure you've heard this term before, 40 acres and a mule. The idea there is if you have land, if you have 40 acres, you have a mule, you have a plow animal, then you can create, you can grow your own food, you can have an independent life. You don't need to rely on somebody else to live if you can grow your own land, if you can have your own homestead. And this is true in both the North and South, this idea of being kind of an independent yeoman farmer, Thomas Jefferson would call them, right? So these radical Republicans believed that if you gave the most powerless people in society, these ex-slaves, land, then they could become independent. Now, how would you get that land? This is where it becomes really problematic. You have to take it away. You can't invent new land. You don't make land, right? So where would the land be taken? It would be taken from the planters, the big planters, the people who had led those southern states before the Civil War, right? So you're kind of Robin Hood, right? You're taken from the rich, you're given to the poor. This is always going to be problematic. In US history, land reform, the idea of taking land from people who don't have it, or I'm sorry, from people who have a lot of it and giving it to people who don't have it, has always been considered very radical. The US has always been hostile to any kind of land reform, no matter where it takes place. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established, and to provide African Americans with these ex-slaves with 40 acres and a mule, right? However, at the outset of the Civil War, there were about 4 million blacks in the United States, and about 3.5 million were slaves. So you have 3.5 million slaves. The Southern population totally was, I think, around 10 million, 9 or 10 million. In the North, it was about 22 million. So a significant percentage, more than a third, I believe, of Southern society were ex-slaves. So you have like 3.5 million ex-slaves. However, the Freedmen's Bureau only worked long enough to provide land to 30 or 40,000, which is a very tiny percentage. You can do the math. It was like 0.1% or 1% or something like that. It's very small. Because of that, they weren't given land. They didn't have access to credit. An ex-slave couldn't go to a bank and get a loan to make a business or something like that. Most had not been given any kind of education. They didn't have any money saved up. So, like I said before, they're set free, without a land, without money. They were given, as one slave said, nothing but freedom. And so this leads them to have to find some other ways to survive. And that's where sharecropping, that image I showed you earlier, becomes really important. Ex-slaves generally took on two different types of work after the Civil War. Some did get land, some became independent, some went to the North, but the majority stayed in the South and continued to work in agriculture. Some worked under what were called contract labor in the contract labor system, which meant you had a contract with somebody who owned land to work for him, right? Now, as you can imagine, whenever you have a contract between somebody who has a lot of land, who's very powerful, and someone who was a slave until recently, that's not going to be an equal contract. So in the contract labor system, these ex-slaves weren't paid well. They didn't, get treated well. They weren't given access to their own land, right? So that's a very unequal situation. Most became sharecroppers. And what's that mean? Sharecropping means that you share the crops, right? They don't get property rights for themselves. It doesn't give you, other than those people who got 40 acres and a mule, 30 or 40,000 ex-slaves, it doesn't give you access to your own land. So it keeps you, in a state of dependency because you have to work for somebody else. So about 75% of these ex-slaves out of 3.5 million, what is that? It's a lot, were sent into contract labor, or more commonly into sharecropping. Now, and sharecropping remained dominant in Southern agriculture until well into the 20th century, really, like into the Great Depression, when you had what was called the Great Migration. A lot of blacks left the South to move to the North. In sharecropping, an ex-slave would make an agreement with a planter. Sometimes it was the same planter that owned you when you were a slave. Some people went back actually to the same plantations where they were held as slaves and made an agreement. These agreements, like contract labor, were always one-sided, in favor of the master for all kinds of obvious reasons. When you have power and wealth, when you can write contracts and you're dealing with people who have no power and wealth, have no money saved up, have no independent living, sometimes don't have education, it's going to be clearly a one-sided deal, right? So they would agree to farm a particular segment, a share of the plantation, and provide part of that, of what they grew, a share of their crops as rent. So that's the deal. You share crops. That's part of your rent. Now, how does that work? So you go to a farmer, you agree to grow crops on whatever, 50 acres, 100 acres, whatever number you want to come up with. And then, what do? Do you just start, well, you don't have anything, right? So you need, what do you need to grow crops? You need tools, you need seed, you need all kinds of stuff. You don't have that. Where do you get it? You don't have any money. So the landowner, the master, who's agreed to share, who's agreed to let you grow crops on this land and give him a part of the crops, for payment, loans you the money to buy the tools and the seed and any other equipment you need to work. So you've already begun this process in debt. Not only do you owe a share of the crops, which is generally a set amount based on, how much you grow, and, there could be a drought that year, there could be floods, there could be who knows what, right? But you still owe him that share of the crops, right? So in addition to that, you have to borrow money for tools and seed, and that loan was based on the future value of the crops you produced. So if you borrow the equivalent of $100 to buy tools and seed, then you owe that planter $100 worth of crop, in addition to what you owe as part of the sharecropping agreement. So as a result of this credit system, it's kind of credit, right? It's kind of like nowadays, like payday loan places, Title Max kind of places do the same thing. You go there for a quickie loan and you get these exorbitant rates. So in this particular case, sharecroppers owed the planter, even before he broke ground, even before they started planting, probably at least 50% or larger share of anything produced. So you're beginning, before you break ground. Once you start to plant something, you already owe more than 50% of what you're gonna get out of that to the planter, and sometimes it's much more than that. Now, since there's a quota, the sharecropper might not make quota. That wasn't unusual to not make quota. drought, flood, market conditions, whatever. So in that particular case, if you didn't make quota, what you do? You had to go back to get another loan. Who'd you get it from? You get it from the planter. So the ex-slaves now are even more in debt. And frequently, the masters would place a lien on a part of the crop that would originally be kept by the sharecropper. You know what a lien is? A lien is a legal note that says you have possession of something, right? So what that lien does is it allows the masters, I'm sorry, the planters, not the masters anymore, the planters, to have legal title to whatever part of that crop is needed to cover their loans to these sharecroppers, these ex-slaves. So the ex-slaves fall even deeper into debt. So the sharecropper owed not only the original 50 or more % to the land holder, but now that amount plus the amount from the loans because you didn't make that quota. And these loans are exorbitant. They're like 30 to 70%. Like I said, it's kind of like payday, loan places, right? So those loans are almost never paid in full. It's virtually impossible because of the way they're set up, the way they're written, and because of these conditions. So because of that, the sharecroppers are in constant debt to the landholders. They can't get out from the debt, which means they can't leave their jobs, right? They can't leave this sharecropping arrangement. And so this was often referred to as debt peonage. If you ever heard of peons in the feudal system, you work for somebody else, you can't get free. Well, that's kind of what you have here. So it's very much like that kind of feudal system, with sharecropping. Landowners, a lot of these people who own slaves, who own these massive plantations, actually thought this was better. And a lot of planters use the phrase, this is better than slavery, because they could, simply keep these ex-slaves in debt, constantly in debt, loaning them money, getting virtually the full share of whatever crops they grew, and they didn't have any responsibility to feed them or anything like that. So for a lot of these these planters, it really was an even better situation. There's a contract that a sharecropper signed. It's in the book, and you should check it out. Let me just read part of it. Every sharecropper must be responsible for all gear and farming implements placed in his hands, and if not returned, must be paid for unless it is worn out by use. You have to pay for everything. Croppers must sow and plow oats and haul them to the crib, but must have no part of them. Not allowed to keep any of it. Nothing is to be sold from their crops, nor fodder, nor corn to be carried from their fields until my rent is all paid. So until all debts are settled with the owner, you don't have access. You don't have control over anything. And all amounts they owe me and for which I am responsible are paid in full. The sale of every cropper's part of the cotton is to be made by me when and where I choose to sell, and after deducting all they owe me. Work of every description is to be done to my satisfaction and must be done over until I'm satisfied that it is to be done as it should be. All right. You understand, the terms of that contract are overwhelming. There's no way you can really get out from under that and develop an independent life that way, right? So this sharecropping system is a huge blow to the possibility that ex-slaves might be not reintegrated, they never were part of American society, might be brought in to American society without the ability to have some kind of land, to have access to credit that isn't so burdensome, like this debt peonage system is. It's virtually impossible to have any kind of independent life. And so what you have is a recreation in many ways of this Southern social system that had existed prior to the Civil War, and one now where a lot of farmers say is better than slavery, right? So the South then really looks very much like it had prior to the Civil War, right? In addition to that, and this is something that you've probably heard about especially in the last 6 months or so, because a lot of people are talking, about kind of the period after Reconstruction, about the Confederacy, national debate and national discussion on this right now. So this is also the period when a lot of really violent groups emerged to challenge blacks in Reconstruction. The immediate period after Reconstruction you had ex-slaves, blacks who were, actually taking political positions. They had, roles in government, and they were, officials and so forth. However, groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which is resurgent today, you start to see them again today, emerged, and they used violent terror to intimidate blacks, not let them vote, not let them participate in government or society. Lynchings became very common. Lynchings, I think traditionally when we think of lynching, we think of somebody being hanged from a tree, which is probably the best known idea of what a lynching is. However, it's more than that. A lynching is a violent attack and murder of African Americans. There were thousands of lynchings in the period after the Civil War. Not only were they hanged, but they were often beaten, they were often stabbed, they might be burned alive. So it's just really horrific. So lynchings became very common. Laws were passed in order to make it impossible for blacks to integrate. So even though you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, blacks aren't part of Southern society. It developed into what was called a Jim Crow system, a system of segregation that really existed, and toward the end of the semester, we'll talk about the civil rights movement in the 1950s, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and others. And the period after the Civil War really created a system that was still pretty much in place for almost a century after that. So the period of Reconstruction offered an opportunity to do something about the problems of slavery, and it didn't. And that was, a great opportunity to do that. But the radical Republicans only had, some level of power briefly. The Freedmen's Bureau only lasted about 18 months or so, and then it was ended. So black were forced into these contract labor or sharecropping agreements, which forced them into deep, deep debt, right? So the systems that existed for the rest of the 19th and into the 20th century were set in that period immediately after the Civil War, during that period of Reconstruction. So you have this economic dependency created by sharecropping and contract labor, and then you have this violent intimidation with groups like the KKK, and wide-scale lynchings, and just wide-scale repression, and the development of a Jim Crow system, a system of segregated facilities, facilities for blacks, facilities for white, rights for blacks, rights for whites. It's a system of apartheid, which is a phrase that we often used in the 20th century to describe South Africa, but it really affects the American South as well. So you have this apartheid system, right? So there's a lot more to it in the book. Make sure, can't say this enough, read the book, because it's really important, I think, to get this stuff, all right? So because you have this, this failure to address the issue of ex-slaves, to really create a different kind of society, a society which is, based on, all men being created equal, or equal rights or freedom or anything like that. You continue to have kind of two separate societies, right? The North and South are very different, right? They're part of the United States prior to the Civil War, but they're very different. Now, after the war, the South kind of takes on a different position. It's kind of a colony. Now, what's that mean? Generally, when we think of colonies, we think of places overseas that a big country controls. So America was a British colony. The Philippines was an American colony. Cuba was basically an American colony. Puerto Rico is sort of like an American colony. Major countries have colonies, so that's not that different. So what does it mean that the South was a colony? We're talking about an internal condition here. So by colony, what I mean is that the South came to exist to benefit Northern interests. After the Civil War, a lot of Northerners invested in the South. The South, remember, was devastated, it had to be rebuilt, so you did have a lot of Northerners. If you've ever seen the word carpetbagger, that often refers to them. It's a bit stretched out. There's more to it than just these Northerners going down to exploit the South. But there was a significant Northern role in the Southern attempt to rebuild its economy after the Civil War. What's more important is the South didn't have industry, and it didn't have factories like the North did. The North, I'll show you a chart later which shows, how different it was. The North was an industrialized society, and it had been moving in that direction before the Civil War, and after the Civil War, even more so, even more rapidly. The South wasn't. The South was an agricultural society. The North has what's called free labor, meaning you're free to work. It's factory work, and the South doesn't. It has slave labor. So they're very fundamentally different societies. So after the war, after the war, the South existed then to provide resources for the North. What did it do? Well, it had cheap labor for agriculture. We've already talked about that because of things like contract labor and sharecropping. But it also produced a lot of raw materials. So Northern industry initially in the 19th century was based on textiles. Textile mills, especially in New England, places near water and water power, right? And what's the raw material for textiles? Obviously, it's cotton, and whereas most cotton produced in the South, right? So you have that. So the South is, and that was the Southern argument during the Civil War. The South believed that it could win the Civil War because it would deprive the North of cotton for industry. It didn't work out that way, right? There are other sources of cotton, Brazil and Egypt and places like that, but that didn't work out. However, raw materials like cotton are still vital, timber, seafood, fish along the coast. So the Northerners end up, still having a vast amount of economic power. Industry is always more valuable than agriculture, right? So even though Southern agriculture existed in a global system of capitalism, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit, actually, that's going to be a big theme this semester: capitalism, the origins of capitalism, the way the economy works. I think that's something that Americans don't talk about a lot, and so I think it's important to kind of understand that. I mean, outside of one's personal relationships, probably the biggest issues in one's life, in your life, are economic. Can you pay tuition? Can you pay rent? Especially nowadays, right? Can you buy a car? Just can you pay for healthcare, that kind of thing. So understanding the way the economy was structured, the way it was organized, the way it was designed to work, I think is really important. And so we're going to talk a fair amount about that. But so in the period after the Civil War, the North wants to create develop this capitalist system. We'll talk about that. And so the South is important, and I don't want to belabor this too much. And again, it's in the book. The South kind of is in this colonial status. It doesn't have the power of the North. It's inferior to the North. Now, one way it gets out from under that is through the kind of stuff we've been hearing about a lot more lately, which is through recreating the story of Southern society in the Civil War. And this is how you get these Southerners to kind of rewrite the history of the war. During the war, the South fought to retain slaves, and it lost. But by the later 19th century, by the later 1800s, it starts to recreate the war as this noble cause. And this is when you start to see the first wave of statues for Confederate heroes going up in the late 1800s, right? Which is, really kind of, it was always striking when I came to Houston and found out that there were schools named after people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. I was really struck by that, and just didn't register, coming from, I grew up in Ohio. So it's very strange, to see all of these statues to a country that seceded, treasonous, and that lost, right? If you've ever gone to Italy, you're not going to see statues of Mussolini, you're not going to see statues of Nazis in Germany. However, all these statues, and that was part of a political idea. The South and the North, kind of accepted this too, because it brought the South back in to the Union that way through these kind of symbolic ideas. So in that regard, a couple of historians have made a claim, which is kind of, controversial, but they don't mean it that way, that the South won the Civil War. They don't mean the South won the Civil War. It actually did. What they meant is Southern ideas, and Southern ideas on things like race, really emerged. They weren't destroyed because the South lost the Civil War. Southern race relations remained the same and would until the 1950s, and in some cases even after that, right? So in that regard, again, like I said before, the possibility of changing these relationships after the Civil War, during this period of Reconstruction, existed, and it didn't work out, right? So it flamed out, right? And so that's a huge problem, right? So so you have the South as a colony, and like I said, you can look at the book for that, but it's vital for Northern economic interest that Southern raw materials are available. Another element in the aftermath of the Civil War that's really important is that with the issue of Southern society and slavery settled, right? Slavery is abolished. You have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, even though the solutions like sharecropping are horrible for ex-slaves. That's settled. The issue is settled. So now Another key goal can be met. The Union has been brought back together. The United States is one country, right? So now that country can begin again expanding to the West. At the same time, in the early 1800s, the United States was trying to decide, how we're going to deal with this northern versus southern issue. It's also moving to the West. And you can't talk about Western movement unless you talk about what the U.S. government did with Indians, with Native Americans, right? So from the earliest days of the United States after it was created, there had been a wide-scale attack on Indians, on tribes. Tribes, remember, are sovereign. Sovereignty means that you are independent. Tribes are not in the United States. They actually exist independent of that. They have their own sovereignty. They're not citizens of the United States. However, the U.S. government, because it needed land, it needed to accumulate land, had never respected tribal sovereignty. So beginning, from the period right after the War for Independence, after the Constitution was written, you had an attack on Indian land and Indian sovereignty. In the 1830s, you had the brutal Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of natives were driven off their land in places like Georgia and the southeastern states, Alabama, and placed in places like Oklahoma on reservations. And then you also had this movement to build to link both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, especially for commercial reasons, right? Most trade existed between the United States and Europe, Britain, France, Germany, but Britain and France, but Britain especially. However, from the earliest days of the Republic, the United States also wanted to be engaged in Pacific trade. It believed that the markets, and this is in 2020, this is still going on, the markets of places like China are really vital, Japan, places like that. So it wanted to create movement to the West as well. How would you do that? Well, you would link the nation by rail. Remember, railroads are all over the place in the 19th century. This is the development, we'll talk about that too, of this massive rail system. So the United States wants to, the American leaders, and this is kind of everybody, Northern and Southern, everybody kind of, Democrats and Republicans all pretty much agree on this, or that the country has to move to the West to develop this national system of transportation so that it can trade and sell stuff from coast to coast, and then also eventually have access to the Pacific, right? If you can develop ports along the western coast, California, Oregon, Washington, places like that, then you can start buying and selling stuff and investing in places in Asia, and especially China. China was always the ultimate goal. Things in 2020, it's not unique. This idea of China, and now this rivalry with China has been going on for quite some time. In this movement west, however, the people in charge of the United States saw what they considered a barrier, and that was the Native Americans. And this came to a head in the period after the Civil War, 1860s, 1870s, especially in South Dakota, area in South Dakota called the Black Hills. And the Black Hills were controlled by the Lakota, or the Sioux Indian. And they were sovereign. It was their territory by treaty. And treaties are agreed to and signed by independent states. Right? It's not like a federal law that applies to a state. A treaty involves independent countries. So there's a treaty that says this is Lakota land. However, gold was discovered on that land. Now, the United States, people in charge of the United States had no problem with getting rid of Indians, with destroying Indians. There had been, and again, read the book, there are a series of massacres, brutal, attacks on Indians, murdering entire tribes, murdering women and children. I forget if it was William Tecumseh Sherman, I forget who it was, who said, kill them all, even the young Indians, because nits make lice, right? So this is dehumanization, really brutal. And so after gold was discovered in the Black Hills, you started to have this massive wave of white, prospectors head out there for a gold rush. They wanted this gold. Now, this is tribal land. This is Lakota land. So, they're not allowed there. It would be, like if you went down to Mexico and started digging for gold, or went to Canada and started digging for oil or hockey pucks or something like that, right? You wouldn't be allowed to do that, right? So what did the U.S. government do? Because these white prospectors, these speculators were in the Black Hills looking for gold, well, they defended them, right? They disregarded Lakota sovereignty and they protected them, and this led to this, massacre of Custer and the 7th Cavalry. The 7th Cavalry came in, and the Lakota wiped them out, right? And that's very famous. That's very well known. However, not long after that, the 7th Cavalry reformed and went back in and then destroyed the Lakota. And so that land, that gold, was controlled then by the American government, by white prospectors. And this was part of what were often called the Indian Wars. It's not a really great title because wars, indicate that there are two sides fighting against each other. That wasn't happening in this particular case. You don't have two sides, equal sides fighting against each other. You have these massacres between the 1870s, 1860s, 1870s until like the 1890s. The last of the so-called great Indian battles occurred at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Famous photo, Crazy Horse was killed there. The Indians used to do a ritual called the ghost dance. The ghost dance was kind of a way to pay honor to one's ancestors. It's like, I always tell people, it's like lighting a candle. If you're Catholic, you go in and you light a candle in, memory of somebody from long ago. And the U.S. government said they're not allowed to do the ghost dance anymore. The U.S. government was also trying to destroy Indian culture, not allow them to dress the way they did, force them to cut their hair, wear Western clothing, white man's clothing, that kind of stuff. And so it told them they weren't allowed to do the ghost dance anymore. They continued to do it. The army showed up. The army claimed that the Lakota shot at them, and it massacred the entire group there. Everybody in the tribe was killed. And this is a famous photo of an elder who was killed, shot dead, and frozen to death, right? That kind of ended the so-called Indian Wars. But what you also had in that period, in addition to these violent attacks and these cultural attacks, were legal attacks. Now, I just closed the screen share, but there's a phrase in the terms called the Dawes Act. In the Dawes Act, the U.S. government, Indians live tribally. They live on communal lands. So it's not like you have an address where you get your mail delivered. These lands are held in common. So what the U.S. government did is it went in and it took land, 138 million acres, massive amount of land. And they created different parcels. It's actually, the technical name for it is the Dawes Severalty Act, meaning that they took that land and put it into several different pieces. So Indians now, these Native Americans, are given a particular parcel of land for themselves rather than having this land communally. Of that 138 million acres, the U.S. government kept over half of it, and they kept the land that was the most agriculturally fertile. So the Indians got less land that was already theirs, and the land they got wasn't as good, and they were told to become independent farmers, but not given any of the tools or the means to do that. So it's really brutal. It ends this long period of repression, both violent and cultural and legal, against Native Americans. For the Americans, it's important because it opens the West. The West is now clear. There's nobody to create any problems. There are no barriers there any longer. So the West is now open to expansion, and this is really important as well. So so that ends that. So that's another element of this. You have this Reconstruction period. The South becomes an economic colony. The issue of slavery isn't really addressed now. Native Americans are wiped out. There's a genocide, this kind of entire ethnic destruction of Native Americans. Tribal sovereignty is just disregarded, and you have the U.S. is now, the Transcontinental Railroad was finally set in the late 1860s, I believe, and now the country is a coast-to-coast market. There aren't that many people out west yet. There are more and more because you had gold, but the east is still way more heavily populated. But it's now a coast-to-coast market. Now this leads us to this point here, which I think is really important, and it's going to be a focus of a lot of what we talk about today. In that the Civil War marked the triumph of industrial capitalism. All right. Now this is a key point. As I said, for the South, the Civil War was about maintaining slavery and going, to the point where they left the United States to try to form their own country so that they could retain slaves. North, obviously, they're Northern abolitionists, but there are kind of multiple issues too. One thing the North wanted to do, in addition to get rid of slavery, was to have a country that was united with a capitalist economy. The South, because it was agrarian, not really much industry there, because it used slave labor, not free labor, was not developed like the North was. It was kind of it was part of a capitalist global market, but it wasn't an industrial capitalist society yet, right? So what the Civil War did was enable the more capitalist North to dominate the agrarian South and change the nature of the entire American economy. All right. What does that mean? Now, there's a lot to this, and we'll talk about a little bit more now, and then in lecture 2, I'll pick up and talk about it some more after that. First of all, what's capitalism? All right. I think that again, read the book, because this is an important idea. We talk about it in the United States, but I'm not sure we really kind of discuss it in ways that we need. Capitalism means that the economy is based on capital, access to capital. What's capital? It's not just money. It's not just money I can pull out of my wallet. If I pull 20 out of my wallet, that's not necessarily capital. It's money that you invest into, things like the means of production. What are the means of production? Means of production are the things that you use to produce stuff, to build things. Means of production are factories, tools, machinery, transport systems, and so forth, right? So capital is controlled by people who also control the means of production, the people who build things, the people who invest money to make stuff, okay? Those are the people who are running society. They're running the government, they're running the economy. Because you have the same people essentially doing both. They're involved in the government, they're involved in the economy. The government exists then, and this is important because it runs kind of contrary to what a lot of people would say. The government exists to develop capitalism. So from this period onward, you will, actually even before that, you always have the government being involved in developing capitalism. It doesn't keep out. You hear a lot of, hands off and stay out, and the government shouldn't be involved in the economy. That's actually quite different. That's not the case at all. The government, in fact, is always involved in developing capitalism, right? A great example of that's the railroads. In the period starting before the Civil War, when railroads developed, how did railroads get developed? Did they just invest a lot of money and build railroads? Railroads got massive grants from the federal government. They were given 122 million acres of land as grants, right? So the government provided that land. States, municipal governments, state governments provided tax-free status to railroads in order to try to get them to go through their particular territories. A good example of this that I often use when I try to describe this idea of the government being involved in the economy is modern day sports stadiums, right? So most cities, build these stadiums. I just read an article the other day about the new Raiders Stadium in Las Vegas. $750 million, three-fourths of $1 billion of that came from hotel taxes. So in that particular case, people pay taxes. And I believe that, what's it called? Minute Maid Park, I think it's, I was going to call it Enron Field again, 40 years ago, right? Minute Maid Park, I think it's the same thing. The public pays to develop, to build these facilities for private interests. The Houston Astros are private interests. The now Las Vegas Raiders are a private interest. Sports teams are privately held, right? Green Bay Packers are actually publicly held, but we can forget about that for now. Sports teams are privately held, yet the public builds these arenas, these stadiums, these facilities for them. So, and this is a good way to understand the way capitalism works. Businesses often get subsidies. The oil companies in the United States get $90 billion in subsidies every year. That's public money given to them to help them with their business. They can get tax breaks, tax cuts, subsidies. The government passes laws to decide which companies will succeed and which won't. And this occurred long before even the Civil War. In 1828, for instance, you had a massive tariff controversy because the North enacted a huge tariff against British commercial goods, especially British textiles. The United States government wanted to develop northern industry. And how do you do that? Well, textile mills were already, in operation, but they could not produce goods the way that Britain could. Britain's Industrial Revolution had preceded the United States. It was far more developed. So the US government developed this big set of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes that you put on stuff coming in, on imports, right? So if Britain was selling textiles to the United States, which they could make much more cheaply than northern textile mills could because they were far more developed, the US government established tariffs. Tariffs have been in the news the last year or two with China, right? So it's something you're probably familiar with already, right? The idea behind tariffs is you protect a particular industry. So if car makers from wherever, in the 1970s, there was an issue with Japan. Japanese cars were much cheaper than American cars, so the US threatened to impose tariffs, taxes on Japanese cars to make them more expensive, right? So in 1828, the government established tariffs against British textile manufacturers so that people would buy stuff from northern textile manufacturers instead. Why? British goods would become too expensive because these taxes would increase their cost by a significant amount. But it also meant that northern textiles would become more expensive too because they didn't have to compete now with the British market. They were protected. Tariffs are often called protected tariffs as well. They were protected by these big tariffs on British goods so they could raise their prices too. And the people who made the stuff that textile manufacturers needed, the looms and the factories and the wood and the iron and whatever, could raise their prices as well because you now had protected industries, right? So this is a case of the government getting involved to take care of a particular capitalist enterprise. Now, what did that mean in 1828? Well, it meant that Britain would retaliate. The British were getting these tariffs, imposed on their textiles, which meant that they were not selling the same amount of goods to the United States that they used to. So what did they do? They retaliated. And this is happening today as well. How do you retaliate? You raise tariffs against the other country. So the British raised tariffs against the United States, but not against textiles because those were already protected. Who did they raise tariffs against? Southern agriculture, because the South was selling a lot of crops, tobacco, sugar, cotton, rice, stuff like that to Europe. So when those tariffs were imposed, they helped northern textile manufacturers. What did the South think of them? They called it the Tariff of Abominations. And in fact, some Southerners, like in South Carolina, at that point said that they wanted to secede from the Union because of these tariffs. So the government is always involved in creating a capitalist society. It doesn't keep its hands off. It doesn't not get involved. It's important. That's part of capitalism. Capitalism is private money, right? It's capital. It's money that you use to develop industry. You control the means of production. You build things, and then you create things, and then you sell things, and you take the money from that and you reinvest it. That's capital. It's not necessarily a $20 bill you take out of your pocket to buy lunch. If you take that $20 bill out and you invest it in a food stand or a food truck, then it's capital. But if you just take it and you buy a sandwich with it, it's money, right? So capital is money that you invest to produce something, to create something, right? The government is also involved in this. It fosters it, it promotes it, it helps some companies, it doesn't help other companies, but it does whatever it can, right? And the last thing I'm going to talk about here, and then we'll make this class 1, and then we'll pick it up again the next time, is that capitalism involves industrialization and incorporation, right? So in the North, the key difference between the North and South prior to the Civil War is that the North had industry. It was developing industry, textiles, manufacturing, railroads, railroad cars, the machines you need in factories, ironworks, things like that. The South didn't have much of that. They had some ironworks and things like that, but South is overwhelmingly agricultural, right? Here's a good example of that. This is a chart describing what these two societies looked like during the Civil War, and it's a pretty good indicator of why the North triumphed, right? So you have population. So 70% of the U.S. Of U.S. citizens lived in, more than U.S. citizens actually, 70% of the people lived in the North. Remember, that 29% includes slaves who aren't citizens. So I think it was like 22 million to 9 or 10 million, roughly somewhere around there, right? Railroads, which are critical for fighting a war, for industry, for commerce, transportation. Railroads are critical in wartime, especially. They bring troops to the front. They can bring goods to the front, ammunition, supplies, reinforcements, things like that. 72% of the railroads were in the North. Now, this is really critical, right? Iron and steel production, the uses of iron and steel in war are obvious. 92-8, overwhelming, right? Wealth, 3/4 of the wealth existed in the North. And that meant the vast majority of capital existed in the North, because much of the wealth in the South was property. Land, plantations, and also slaves were considered property, right? So capital was much more important in the North. Exports. Now, the South boasted all the time about the value of cotton and king cotton, but in fact, the North had more than twice as much in terms of export value as the South did, as the Confederacy did. Factories like iron and steel, overwhelming. The only advantage the South had was, of course, on large farms. But even with that, the North produced massive amounts of wheat and other kinds of crops too. So the North had overwhelming superiority, domination, in fact, over the South in terms of this new kind of economic system, this capitalist economic system that was developing. It also meant that it had more corporations. Before capitalism, before these big industries, you had a lot of kind of smaller businesses. Well, most people are small farmers, but you might be like, shoemaker as an example I'll use throughout the semester, probably because there's a lot of stuff that's been written about that. So if you're a shoemaker, you have a little shop in your backyard where people come in and they get fitted and you make them a pair of shoes. And after that, somebody might come through and say, hey, I have an idea. Why don't you make 15 pair of shoes for me, different sizes, and I'll go out and sell them. Kind of a merchant, right? And then, to kind of skip a bunch of steps, you might get to the point where somebody just builds a factory and they put machines in there to make shoes, right? Now, that means that the original guy, the original skilled shoemaker, is out of business now. But that factory is vastly different than that original, business where you had somebody making shoes in the backyard or, in a shed. So these factories now become incorporated. Corporations are huge business enterprises, and they're essential for capitalism, right? What's a corporation? It's a business in which people can invest money to purchase a part of that business, right? So you do that by selling stock. So what's that mean? Well, you probably know already, right? If you want to, you can go online nowadays, right? And you can buy stock in, GM or Google or Microsoft or, a million other companies. You can have a particular piece of that, and then you can follow, the stock market to see if it goes up, it goes down, how much money you make, right? For corporations, this is really important. For businesses, it's really important because you get access to capital that way. Now, if you don't incorporate, in the old days, 18th century, where would you get your money? Well, you could go to a bank. Yeah, you can go to a bank and borrow money, but two problems there. One, if you're going to try to develop like a railroad company, you need vast amounts of money, immense amounts of money, capital, and banks probably won't loan you that much. They probably aren't capable of it. And also, when you get a loan, what do you have to do? Pay it back, right? So that's a problem. So what do? By incorporating, those loans are interest-free. You have access to massive amounts of capital because, if I go to a bank and say I want $1 billion, they're gonna laugh at me. But if I incorporate, and say I need $1 billion of investment, I can get it that way, right? If I go to a bank, they're gonna say, well, you have to pay, whatever 5% interest on whatever you take out. Although nowadays with the Fed, you obviously don't. They just invent money, right? They click on a mouse and there's trillions invented. But let's go with this, all right? So I don't have to pay it back if I incorporate, right? I'm only on the hook for my money. So if you buy 500 shares and my business goes out, I blow it and it's useless, you lose that money. I don't owe it back to you, right? So incorporation is really vital because it limits my liability. I'm only responsible for the amount of money I've put into it. If you invest in it, then and we lose that money, you're out of luck, not me. And it gives me access to this vast amount, this vast amount of money as well, right? So that's how capitalism is constructed. And that's really important because in the period after the Civil War, it really emerges now that the issues of slavery between the North and South have been settled. That conflict has been settled. the country has expanded into the West. It's removed what it considers this human barrier of tribal, of sovereign Indian tribes, right? So you now have a capitalist country, a country that's becoming more and more industrial, more and more based on the power of corporations who have access to capital, who control the means of production, who control factories, who control railroads, who control banks, and are ready to just explode and make the United States the biggest, most powerful and wealthy country, you know, in global history. All right. So that's a good place to stop lecture one. You know, as you watch this, as I said before, if you have any questions, just send them to us. Follow closely on Blackboard. Lecture two will be up soon, and that'll cover the period after this. Generally, if you were in class, there would be 2 lectures a week, obviously Tuesday and Thursday. So there will obviously be at least 2 new ones up every week, maybe more than that if I get ahead. So you'll never be behind. We'll let you know when the exams are going to be held and what's going to be covered and all that kind of stuff. I know this is a different format. It's kind of weird for me to sit here and look at myself on the screen and lecture, but I think it went well, and I'm sure that you'll get something out of it. Read the books, read those carefully and closely. Stay in contact with us if you have any questions. You know, don't get stressed out and anxious about this. You'll all do well. You know, we'll get you through it. So be safe, take care of yourself, wear a mask, wash your hands, you know, all that kind of stuff. So take care. Thank you.